I remember the exact texture of the paper when I found it, the way the heavy stock felt against my thumb, crisp and expensive, smelling faintly of ink and something else, something like secrecy. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray, rain-slicked afternoon that makes you want to stay inside and pretend the world hasn't started yet. And I was folding laundry in the small apartment we shared in Queens. It wasn't a bad apartment, not really, but it was the kind of place you settle into when you are building a life from the ground up, where the radiators clank like old bones and the windows rattle when the subway passes beneath the street. We had chosen this place together, Elias and I, because we wanted something modest, something that felt real. He had told me he was a freelance consultant, that work was sporadic, that we needed to be careful with our money until his next big contract came through. I believed him. I believed him because at 42, I had learned to look people in the eye when they spoke, and Elias always looked me in the eye. He had a steadiness about him, a quiet intensity that I had mistaken for stability, not realizing that sometimes the stillest waters are the deepest, and sometimes they are hiding the most dangerous currents. I was folding his suit jacket, the one he wore to those vague meetings he often had in Manhattan, the ones he said were for coffee with potential clients, but always came back from looking exhausted, drained as if he had fought a war instead of having a conversation. My hand went into the pocket to check for tissues or receipts, a habit my mother taught me, always check the pockets before you wash, and that was when my fingers brushed against the envelope. It wasn't a receipt for coffee. It wasn't a bill for utilities. It was a statement from a private wealth management firm, one of those names you only see on the sides of skyscrapers in the financial district, and the number printed at the bottom of the page was not one that belonged to a freelance consultant struggling to make rent. It was a number that belonged to a life I did not recognize, a life of private jets and estate managers and security details, a life that stood in stark, violent contrast to the ramen noodles we had eaten for dinner the night before because he said he was waiting for a paycheck to clear. I stood there in the quiet of the living room, the rain tapping against the glass, holding that piece of paper as if it were a live wire, and I felt the floor tilt beneath me. It wasn't just the money. Anyone can have money. It was the lie. It was the calculated, deliberate construction of a reality that did not exist, built specifically to see how I would react to having nothing. I was not angry, not in the way people expect you to be when they find out they have been deceived. Anger is hot, and anger is impulsive, and I have spent too many years learning that anger clouds the vision. Instead, I felt a cold clarity wash over me, a sharpness that cut through the confusion. I looked at the jacket, at the fine wool that he had told me was from a thrift store in Brooklyn, and I realized that every thread of our relationship for the past year might be woven from the same deception. I did not throw the paper down. I did not scream. I folded the statement back into the envelope, and I placed it back into the pocket of the jacket, and I hung the jacket back in the closet exactly where it had been. I needed to think. I needed to understand not just what he had done, but why he had done it, because people do not construct elaborate lies without a reason, and Elias was not a malicious man. I knew that much. I knew the way he held my hand when we walked through the park. I knew the way he listened when I talked about my work at the design firm. I knew the kindness in his voice when he spoke to strangers. A malicious man would not have those things. A malicious man would not look at me with such genuine fear in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. So I sat down on the edge of the bed, the laundry basket still open at my feet, and I began to reconstruct the last year in my mind, looking for the cracks I had missed, the moments where the mask had slipped. We had met at a charity gala, of all places, though he had told me later he was just working the catering staff, a story I found charmingly humble at the time. He had approached me when I was standing alone near the balcony, looking out at the city lights, and he had asked me what I thought about the view. We talked for an hour. He didn't ask me what I did for a living until the end of the conversation, and when I told him, he nodded with genuine interest, not calculating interest. That was the hook. That was the moment I let my guard down. I am a woman who has built her own security, who has navigated divorce and career shifts and the slow, quiet aging that happens when you pass 40 without losing your mind. I value authenticity above all else. I told him early on that I didn't care about money, that I cared about partnership, about someone who would stand beside me when the storms came. He had agreed. He had sworn that was all he wanted too. And now, holding the evidence of his vast wealth in my mind, I had to ask myself if I was the one being tested, or if he was testing himself. I stood up and walked to the kitchen to make tea, because my hands were shaking, just slightly, a betrayal of the calm I was trying to project. The kettle whistled, a sharp, lonely sound in the quiet apartment. I poured the water over the bag and watched the steam rise, thinking about the implications. If he was this wealthy, why were we living here? Why was he driving a 10-year-old Honda that broke down in the winter? Why did he flinch when I suggested we go to a nice restaurant for my birthday? It was a performance. Our entire life was a stage play, and I was the only audience member who didn't know the script. But why? The question looped in my mind, over and over. Was it past trauma? Was he afraid I was a gold digger? Was he so scarred by previous relationships that he needed to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I loved him for himself and not for his portfolio? It was a cruel test, yes, but cruelty often stems from fear. I took the mug into the living room and sat by the window, watching the rain blur the city lights. I decided then that I would not confront him immediately. Confrontation without preparation is just noise. I needed evidence, not just of the wealth, but of the intent. I needed to know how deep this went. Was it just the money, or was everything else a lie? I needed to be sure before I spoke, because once I spoke, the dynamic would change forever. I could not unknow this. I could not pretend that the paper in his pocket didn't exist. So I began to observe him with a new kind of attention, a forensic attention. I watched the way he checked his phone, shielding the screen with his hand when a certain type of message came through. I watched the way he dressed when he said he was going to a job interview, the suit too perfect, the shoes too polished for a man claiming to be in a cash crunch. I noticed that he never invited me to meet his family, always saying they were abroad, or busy, or difficult. I noticed that he paid for everything in cash, small bills, as if he were trying to avoid a paper trail. Yet the bank statement I had found was clearly digital, clearly modern. There were inconsistencies everywhere, little fractures in the glass of his story. I started doing my own research, quietly. I used my lunch breaks at work to look up public records, using the full name he had given me. Elias Thorne. It wasn't a common name. It took me 3 days to find the connection. He was the CEO of Thorne Industries, a logistics company based in Connecticut. The news articles were from 5 years ago, before he had gone somewhat off the grid. There were photos of him at galas, shaking hands with senators, standing in front of buildings with his name on the cornerstone. He wasn't just wealthy. He was powerful, and he was hiding it from me. The hurt hit me then, a physical wave that made me sit down at my desk and close my eyes. It wasn't the money. I could handle the money. It was the lack of trust. He had looked into my eyes, he had held me in the night, and he had decided that I was not trustworthy. He had decided that I was capable of loving a lie, or perhaps he was afraid I was capable of loving the truth only if it came with a price tag. It made me feel small. It made me feel like a specimen in a jar, being poked and prodded to see how I would react. But I am not a specimen. I am a woman who has loved and lost and learned, and I deserve better than to be tested like a child. I went home that evening and made dinner, just as I always did. He came in looking tired, shaking the rain off his coat, apologizing for being late, saying the client meeting had run long. I smiled at him. I kissed his cheek. I asked him how it went, and he told me it was fine, just more delays. I watched his face as he lied to me, and I saw the tension in his jaw, the slight flicker in his eyes. He was carrying a burden. He was living a double life, and it was exhausting him. I realized that while I was hurt, he was also suffering. He was trapped in his own deception. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay awake listening to his breathing, wondering when the end would come. I could leave. I could pack a bag and walk out, leave a note explaining that I knew that I wasn't who he thought I was, that I didn't play games. But that felt like running. That felt like letting the misunderstanding win. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth to be spoken aloud between us, not discovered in a pocket or on a website. I wanted to give him the chance to tell me, because if he never told me, then the lie would always be there, a ghost in the room. So I waited. I waited for a week, gathering my strength, preparing my words. I wanted to be calm. I wanted to be firm. I wanted to show him that I was not the enemy he feared. During that week, I also reached out to a friend, Sarah, who is a lawyer. I didn't tell her everything, just that I suspected financial deception in a relationship and needed to know my standing. She told me that if we were not married and there was no commingling of assets, I had no claim to his wealth, which was fine by me. I didn't want his wealth. I wanted my dignity. She advised me to document everything, just in case things turned sour. I took photos of the bank statement. I saved the links to the articles about his company. I protected myself, not because I planned to sue him, but because knowledge is power, and I refused to be powerless in my own life. The weekend came, and he suggested we go for a walk in Central Park. It was a crisp autumn day, the leaves turning gold and red, the air smelling of wood smoke and decay. We walked in silence for a while, holding hands, and I felt the warmth of his palm, the familiarity of his grip. It was hard to reconcile this man with the stranger I had read about online. We sat on a bench near the boat lake, watching the children sail their toys on the water. He looked peaceful there, for the first time in weeks. I decided this was the moment. Not in the apartment where walls could feel like traps, but out here, under the open sky. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs. I turned to him. I told him we needed to talk. He stiffened immediately. I saw the defense mechanisms kick in, the shoulders rising, the eyes narrowing slightly. He asked if something was wrong. I told him that I thought there was something we needed to be honest about. He laughed, a nervous, brittle sound, and said he was always honest with me. I looked at him, and I kept my voice steady. I told him that honesty is not just about what you say, but about what you hide. I told him that I knew about Thorn Industries. I told him that I knew about the accounts. I told him that I knew he was not a freelance consultant. The color drained from his face. It was like watching a light switch being turned off. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to bluff. He just looked at me, and I saw the shame there, raw and unfiltered. He looked down at his hands, clasped tightly in his lap. He asked me how long I had known. I told him a week. He asked me why I hadn't said anything. I told him I was waiting for him to tell me. He shook his head, saying he couldn't. He said he was afraid. I asked him what he was afraid of. He said he was afraid of losing me. It was such a simple answer, and yet it carried the weight of everything. He told me about his first marriage. He told me how she had left him when the company hit a rough patch, how she had taken half of everything and walked away without a backward glance. He told me how he had sworn never to let anyone close again unless he was sure, unless he knew they loved the man and not the money. He said he had met me when he was trying to be normal, trying to escape the pressure, and he had fallen in love with the way I treated him when I thought he had nothing. He said the test was supposed to be over months ago, but he had gotten scared to reveal the truth because he thought once I knew, I would look at him differently. He thought I would feel betrayed, and he was right. I listened to him without interrupting. I let him speak until he had nothing left to say. I watched the ducks on the water. I felt the wind on my face. I processed his words not with emotion, but with logic. He had acted out of fear. He had deceived me to protect himself. It was wrong, it was damaging, but it was not malicious. It was a failure of courage, not a failure of character. When he finished, he looked at me, waiting for the verdict, waiting for me to walk away. I reached out and took his hand. I told him that I was hurt. I told him that trust is like a mirror, and once it is broken, you can never see yourself in it quite the same way again. But I also told him that I understood fear. I told him that I had my own fears, my own walls that I had built after my divorce. I told him that we were both damaged people trying to find a way to be whole. I asked him if he loved me. He said yes, without hesitation. I asked him if he was willing to do the work to fix this, to be transparent, to go to therapy, to open the books, to let me see everything so there would never be a shadow between us again. He said yes. He said he would do anything. I told him that anything was too much. I told him I just wanted the truth. I stood up and told him we should go home. He stood up too, looking uncertain, as if he wasn't sure if he was allowed to walk beside me. I took his arm. I told him that we were not done. I told him that this was not the end, but it was the end of the lie. We walked back to the car in silence, but it was a different silence. It was no longer the silence of secrecy. It was the silence of two people who had just stepped onto shaky ground, knowing they had to build a bridge together. When we got back to the apartment, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt lighter, though the tension was still there, humming beneath the surface. He went to the closet and took out the suit jacket, the one with the statement in the pocket. He took the envelope out and handed it to me. He said I should have it. He said he didn't want to hide anything anymore. I took it and placed it on the table. I told him that I didn't need his money. I told him that I needed his trust. I told him that from now on, we would make decisions together. If he wanted to live in this apartment, we would live in this apartment. If he wanted to move to a estate in Connecticut, we would discuss it. But there would be no more secrets. He nodded. He looked relieved, but also exhausted. The weight of the mask had been heavy, and now that it was off, he looked vulnerable. I made tea again. We sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten so many simple meals, and we talked. We talked for hours. He told me about the company, about the pressure he was under, about the loneliness of being wealthy. I told him about my work, about my fears of not being enough, about why I had stayed silent for a week. I told him that I needed to know that he was capable of telling the truth before I could forgive the lie. He understood. He said he respected that. He said he was grateful I hadn't just left. I told him I considered leaving. I told him that the temptation was there. But I told him that I valued what we had built, even if the foundation was shaky. I told him that I believed in repair. I believed that people are more than their worst mistakes. He reached across the table and took my hand. His palm was warm. He thanked me. He said I was the most remarkable woman he had ever known. I told him not to put me on a pedestal. I told him I was just a woman who wanted honesty. We agreed to start over, not to erase the past, but to build a new future on top of it, with the truth as the bedrock. The next few weeks were difficult. There were moments of insecurity, moments where I would look at him and wonder if there was another hidden account, another hidden life. He sensed this. He didn't get defensive. He opened his phone to me. He showed me his emails. He introduced me to his business partner over a video call. He invited me to meet his sister, who he had claimed was abroad. She was in Boston, and we drove up to see her. She was lovely, and she apologized for his behavior, saying he had been difficult since the divorce. She told me he talked about me constantly, that he was afraid of scaring me off with his wealth. It validated his story. It helped me to see him not as a manipulator, but as a frightened man. I started to relax. The guard I had put up began to lower, inch by inch. We decided to move. Not to a mansion, but to a place that was ours. A home that reflected who we were now, not who he pretended to be, and not who I pretended to be to accommodate him. We found a house in Westchester, something modest but comfortable, with a garden and a study for him and a studio for me. We bought it together. We put both our names on the deed. It was a symbolic act, but it mattered. It mattered because it said we were partners. It said that my contribution was equal to his, regardless of the dollar amount. During the move, we found more things. Boxes of his old life that he had kept in storage. Photos of him with presidents, awards, contracts. He went through them with me. He told me the story behind each one. He didn't hide the success. He didn't apologize for it. He just owned it. And I own my reaction to it. I found that I didn't care about the awards. I cared about the way he looked at me when he showed them to me, proud but humble. I cared that he was finally being real. One evening, a month after the revelation, we were unpacking books in the new house. It was late, and we were tired. He pulled out a small box from the bottom of a crate. I froze. I thought it was another secret. He saw my face and smiled, a sad, gentle smile. He opened the box. It was an engagement ring. He told me he had bought it 6 months ago. He told me he had been waiting for the right time to ask me, but he couldn't ask me while he was lying to me. He said he couldn't build a marriage on a foundation of deceit. He got down on one knee right there on the floor, surrounded by stacks of books and packing tape. He asked me to marry him, not as a billionaire, not as a test, but as Elias. Just Elias. I looked at him, I looked at the ring. It was beautiful, but it was just an object. The value was in the question. I thought about the pain of the last month. I thought about the betrayal. I thought about the work we had done to get to this moment. I thought about the choice I had made to seek clarity instead of vengeance. I realized that this moment was only possible because I had chosen to stay. Because I had chosen to understand. I said yes. I said yes because I knew who he was now, I knew his flaws, I knew his fears, and I loved him anyway. He slipped the ring on my finger. It fit perfectly. We sat on the floor and cried, both of us, letting go of the tension, letting go of the fear. It was a release. It was the end of the struggle. After that, things changed. The dynamic shifted from protector and protected to partners. We attended events together. I wore the dress he wanted me to wear, not because he demanded it, but because I felt beautiful in it. He introduced me as his fiancée, not his guest. He stopped checking his phone during dinner. He stopped hiding his income. We merged our finances, not because I needed his money, but because it was a sign of unity. We set up a joint account for household expenses, and we kept our individual accounts for personal freedom. It was a balance. It was healthy. We went to counseling together, not because we were broken, but because we wanted to be strong. The therapist helped us navigate the trust issues. She helped him understand that testing me was a violation of my autonomy. She helped me understand that his fear was not about me, but about his past. We learned to communicate without accusation. We learned to say I am scared instead of saying you are lying. It was a new language, and we were both learning to speak it. A year later, we were married. It was a small ceremony, just family and close friends. No press, no gala. Just love. I wore a dress that I loved, not a designer gown that cost more than a car. He wore a suit that fit him well, but not one that screamed wealth. We exchanged vows that we had written ourselves. He promised to always tell me the truth, even when it was hard. I promised to always listen, even when I was hurt. We meant it. We meant every word. The honeymoon was quiet. We went to a cabin in the mountains, no Wi-Fi, no phones, just us. We talked about the future. We talked about children maybe someday. We talked about retirement. We talked about everything. There were no more shadows. The sun shone through the windows, and the light was clear. I often think back to that day in the apartment, the day I found the statement. I think about how easily I could have reacted differently. I could have screamed. I could have packed my bags. I could have posted about it online, exposed him for the fraud he was. But that would have been easy. That would have been reactive. Choosing clarity was hard. Choosing to understand was hard. But it was worth it. Because now, when I look at him, I see the man, not the money. And when he looks at me, I know he sees the woman, not the opportunity. We are safe with each other. That is the only wealth that matters. There are days when the old insecurities flare up. He will hesitate before buying something expensive, worried I will think he is showing off. I will hesitate before asking for something, worried I will seem greedy. But we talk about it. We bring it into the light, we disarm it. The trust is not perfect. It is not the blind trust of the beginning. It is a earned trust. It is a trust that has been tested by fire and came out stronger. I am proud of that. I am proud of us. I am proud that I did not let anger dictate my life. I am proud that I valued the relationship enough to fight for it, not with weapons, but with words. People say that love is blind. I disagree. Love is seeing. Love is seeing the flaws and the fears and the mistakes and choosing to stay anyway. It is seeing the truth and accepting it. That is what we have. We have sight, we have clarity, and we have each other. Sometimes, in the evening, we sit on the porch of our house in Westchester, watching the sun go down over the trees. He holds my hand. The ring glints in the fading light. We don't need to speak. We know what we are thinking. We know what we have survived. We know what we have built. It is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. I remember the rain on that Tuesday. I remember the cold paper in my hand. I remember the fear. But I also remember the choice. I chose love. I chose truth. And because of that, I have a life that is real, no more tests, no more masks, just us. And that is the best story I could ever ask for. The journey was not easy. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I was a fool. There were nights when he lay awake wondering if he had ruined everything. But we woke up each morning and chose each other again. That is the secret. That is the work. It is not the grand gestures. It is not the money. It is the daily decision to be honest, to be vulnerable, to be kind. We have learned that lesson well. We teach it to each other every day. I look at my life now and I see the beauty in the struggle. I see the value in the pain. It brought us here. It brought us to this peace. I would not change it. I would not change the discovery. I would not change the confrontation. Because without the break, there would be no repair. Without the truth, there would be no trust. And I value trust above all else. It is the currency of the heart. And we are rich. We are so incredibly rich. Not in the bank accounts, though those are secure, but in the knowing, in the safety, in the love. I tell this story not to boast, but to remind myself, to remind us, that it is possible, that people can change, that mistakes can be forgiven, that love can survive the hardest tests, provided you are willing to do the work, provided you are willing to choose clarity over anger. That is the lesson, that is the gift, and I hold it close. I hold it close every day. The wind blows through the trees on the porch. The tea is warm in my mug. He is sitting next to me, his shoulder against mine. The world is quiet, the world is good, and we are home.